What I'm talking about is stickiness today. In the end, it's all about stickiness. Like, I think that's a nice sticky trail, that nice paved trail that's out by Bixler Lake there. And if you don't walk out of the room with anything else, if you have a concept of stickiness, that'll be a good thing. And more importantly, if you bring your work to creating a stickier county, that will be better still. This is what I'm going to do to you today. This is the pain in the rear end of my presence. I'm going to not give you the happy, everything is great story. I'm going to give you the what are you going to do next story. That's what it's about. Because I take this challenge very, very seriously. I'm going to open with a little perspective, an exercise I'm going to ask you to all join me in, and then a brief rant. Everybody has to hear the Fenton rant. It's the price of admission. You got to listen to my rant. It's short, but it's focused. Then I'm going to talk about how we actually spend our time. You have finite time and resources. You can't do everything. So the question should be, what do we spend our time on? I'll talk to you about where I believe the research steers us on that. And I will talk about stickiness in terms of what we call the 3 Ps: programmatic, project, and policy level intervention. I'm going to get pretty concrete and leave you with some ideas based on what I've learned from you about the challenges you face. But let's start at this place. Everybody do this for me. This is the perspective exercise. Think back to your earliest fond recollection of having been physically active as a youngster. Okay, now think back to little kid. I'm not talking high school sports. I'm talking little like the picture here. Your earliest fond recollection of being physically active. Everybody got it? Get that in your mind, then turn to the person next to you. 10 seconds each, share your recollection starting now. 20 seconds total, go. So I know it would be much more fun to spend the next hour talking about that stuff than to have to listen to me. And I can tell because people actually get animated when they start telling their stories. They start acting stuff out. They talk about climbing trees and riding bikes. They do this, even though you ride your bike like this, not like this. But and a lot of people mention bicycles and tricycles. People mention walking in the woods, playing in the woods. You specifically said, I remember being outside all day and having to be dragged indoors when the street lights came on at night. I want to ask you a series of questions, and I want you to raise your hand if your answer is affirmative to the question I asked. How many of you did your recollection entail largely being with kids of the same age and gender? Same age and gender. So if you were a 12-year-old boy, you're only hanging around with 12-year-old boys. Only the same age and gender. Okay, how many of you was an adult necessarily involved in the activity that you were thinking of? How many of you did the activity occur at a scheduled time and place? For how many of you was a uniform an important part of the activity? How about a referee or an umpire being critical to the activity that you recall? Okay. For how many of you were you with kids of different ages and different genders? A variety of kids, some older, younger, boys, girls. Okay. How many of you did not have to have an adult present for the activity that you were doing? How many could not have gotten away with what they were doing if an adult had in fact been present? You'll notice the 2 law enforcement officers won't admit to it, but they're both remembering. They don't raise their hands for that. How many of you had water as part of your recollection? Swimming in it, fishing in it, damming up the little neighborhood creek, going after salamanders, any of that kind of stuff. How many had a fort in the woods or a special place that you kind of hung out? How many of you had a wheeled vehicle as part of your recollection? A scooter, a bike, a tricycle, skates, skateboard? Right. How many of you, if I were to vastly oversimplify it, I think you'll recognize the term, so let me indulge me if you will and allow me to use this term. How many of you, to some degree or another, recall having been a free-range kid? Sort of a free-range kid to some degree or another, okay? By the way, people who are raising their hands like that, that's a cop-out. You're being a weenie. Raise your hand as high as your ear. Your elbow as high as your ear. I'm not asking you to do anything else. That's all you got to do to put yourself out there. Don't do this, do this. All right. How many of you, and these last 2 questions are the only 2 that really matter for the day, so bear with me. How many of you believe the majority of children today are actually free-range kids? The majority today. Last question. It's the only one that matters. How many of you believe it's good for kids, good for their health, good for that obesity data that Kathy just shared, that they're not free range? It's a good thing we don't have free range kids anymore. Hands up for that. Think about what we just did. Last 3 questions. Only a generation or so ago, I mean, we're not that old in this room, we were a lot of free range kids. And now, 20, 30, 40 years later, we don't have as many free range kids, and it's probably not good for them. My simple question is this. Are you okay with that? Are you going to do something about it? Now, you can say, Mark, that's all well and good. Idea of free-range kids running around all day Saturday on your friends with a bike, walking to school. But the reality is, We can't do it in the modern day and age. In fact, any parent, you ask them, would you let your kid walk to school? The first reason they tell you they can't is not safe. There are these weird, scary men with big, thick mustaches waiting behind every tree to abduct our children. Scary men. Who can tell me the percentage increase in violent crime against children over the last 40 years? By the way, the very time span in which the number of children that walked to school went from 50% of kids in 1970 to about 10% of kids now. And over the same time span, the number of kids who were driven by car to school went from about 10% of kids in 1970 to about 50% now. Does everybody understand what I just said? They've identically swapped walking versus being driven by the car. Not school bus, being driven by car. In that time span, what is the percentage increase in violent crime against kids? Who knows the answer? Is it 100%? Has it doubled? Is it 500%? Is it 5 times worse? Please tell me the answer. Not a rhetorical question. Somebody has to say a number before I move on. 10%. There's a good guess. Any others? 0 would be the right answer. And that's why you didn't say it, because you knew that was the answer, but nobody was willing to actually put it out there, because we live in fear. We've all made this same decision. Can't let little Jimmy walk to the corner store, petrified of a fear that we all know in our rational brain is in fact not any worse than when our parents let us literally disappear on a Saturday morning with our buddies on our bikes and not know precisely